خذني إلي لأنتمي لجنازتي في يوم عيدي، خذني إلى عيدي شهيدا في بنفسجة الشهيد. عادوا ولكن لم أعد، خذني هناك إلى هناك من الوريد إلى الوريد.
2 years after his death of a heart surgery complication, at the age of 67 on Saturday 9th August 2008, Mahmoud Darwish has remained at the heart of Arab literary scene, more inspirational than ever to critics and readers alike in the Arab world, who remember him as one of the greatest Arab poets in modern times. His absence did not eclipse his poetic presence, as he resembles the voice of Palestinian aspiration for freedom and independence. Palestine, his primary subject, has been central to his poetry, animating his poems in every meaningful trope and metaphor.
سيدة الأرض أم البدايات أم النهايات كانت تسمى فلسطين، صارت تسمى فلسطين.
Knowing the high emotional and cultural significance of Palestine for all Arabs and freedom-loving people across the world, one can understand Darwish's great appeal and popularity in the Arab world today. He was most inventive and productive as his vision grew more dialogic, deeply rooted in the daily agony of his people under occupation. So he felt free to address topics which inherently touch the dreams of the displaced Palestinians everywhere. That's why his poems were increasingly concerned with the collective Palestinian tragedy and the paradoxical nature of living in a cruel and alienating world which does not recognize the legitimate rights of others for self-determination.
أنا يعني جزء عضوي من هذه التراجيديا وجزء عضوي من هذا الشعب، ولا أستطيع أحيانا أن أفصل بين صوتي الفردي وصوت الجماعة في صوتي الفردي. فأنا متلاحم بهذا الحد إلى درجة أنني أرفض أحيانا كثيرة الدفاع عن نفسي، لأن أعتبر أنه
However, Darwish always knew how to recreate his own homeland through fully identifying himself with the usurped land, body and soul, that even the name Palestine has become an act of existence, if not resistance, as he so eloquently expresses in a poem called A Lover from Palestine. Her eyes are Palestinian, her name is Palestinian, her dress and sorrow Palestinian, her feet and body Palestinian, her words and silence Palestinian, her voice Palestinian, her birth and her death Palestinian. The physical description here is so important in keeping the image of Palestine forever alive in the poet's dream of return. Palestine should continue to live in the hearts and minds of Arabs everywhere. Hence, in Darwish's poetry, love for Palestine is constantly reinforced by memories of the homeland, its lakes, rivers, mountains, plains, olives, oranges, birds, streets, and pavements. Poetry for Darwish is actually to a vision of liberating Palestine and removing once for all the ugly Israeli occupation.
وأحمل الأرض الصغيرة مثل كيس من ضباب، أصحو وأبحث في ملابس جثتي عني فنضحك، نحن ما زلنا على قيد الحياة.
Darwish was born in 1942 in the Palestinian village of Al-Barwi, east of Acre and the north of Palestine. He and his family were forced by Israeli occupiers to leave his village and take refuge in Lebanon. Shortly afterwards, Al-Barwi was literally razed to the ground by the Israeli army. A year later, he slipped back to his homeland. After finishing high school in 1960, he worked as a journalist in Haifa. He was jailed and put under house arrest many times by the Israeli occupation authorities for his poetry and other writings, and for his national commitment to his cause. He finally left the occupied territories in 1971, lived in exile in Cairo, Beirut, and Tunis in turn, then Paris. In 1995, he moved to Amman, and in 1996 to the West Bank. In Ramallah, he resumed editing Al-Carmel, the quarterly literary magazine he had edited in Beirut and Paris. Darwish published over 30 volumes of poetry and 8 books of prose. His first poetry collection, called Leaves of Olives, included his famous poem Identity Card, written in 1964, which crystallizes the Palestinian resistance against Israeli attempts to erase Palestinian identity and history.
ورقم بطاقتي 50,000
سجل أنا عربي ورقم بطاقتي 50,000.
Write down, I am an Arab, and the number of my card is 50,000. I have 8 children, and the 9th is due after summer. Write down, I am an Arab. I am a name without a title, patient in a country where everything lives in a whirlpool of anger. My roots took hold before the birth of time.
سنمضي إلى حتفنا.
His poetry mirrors the Palestinian tragedy at its most intense, most transforming moments, depicting razed villages, confiscated houses, destroyed fields, and the wounded topography of a stolen memory. Although Darwish glorified the resilience and mythical steadfastness of Palestinians under occupation, he also voiced their agony and humanity, as he expresses in his poem, Under Siege. Here on the slopes of hills, facing the dusk and the cannon of time, close to the gardens of broken shadows, we do what prisoners do, and what the jobless do. We cultivate hope. When the planes disappear, the white doves fly off and wash the cheeks of heaven with unbound wings, taking radiance back again, taking possession of the ether and of play. Higher, higher still the white doves fly off. Ah, if only the sky were real. A man passing between 2 bombs said to me. In 1988, at the height of the first Palestinian Intifada, Mahmoud Darwish wrote a poem that shook the Israeli occupation authorities. The poem, "Those Who Pass Between Fleeting Words," aims at exposing the brutality of the Israeli army in violating the sacred rights of the Palestinians and in violently putting down the unarmed Palestinian Intifada. It was frank, direct, and uncompromising.
أيها المارون
Oh, those who pass between fleeting words, carry your names and be gone.
أسماءكم وانصرفوا واسحبوا
Rid your time of your hours and be gone. Steal what you will from the blueness of the sea and the sand of memory. Take what pictures you will so that you understand that which you never will. How a storm from our land builds the ceiling of our sky.
أيها المارون بين الكلمات العابرة حاصر حصارك.
Yet many of Darwish's poems were written during the second Intifada, when Darwish was in Ramallah, where he had been living since 1996. He was very close to the scene of events, taking inspiration from the extraordinary steadfastness of those unarmed Palestinians who were confronting the Israeli war machinery with their bare hands. He celebrated their sacrifices and wrote about their martyrdom, reflecting the Palestinian dream of national independence. He wrote about the paradox of living under siege day and night, highlighting the bleeding tragedy of average Palestinians who refuse to succumb to the will of the aggressors.
أنا ابن شعب.
If Palestine remained at the heart of Darwish's poetic vision, it also became a metaphor for history's darkness and cruelty. Darwish knew to magnify the metaphor of displacement by creating a broader frame of reference, invoking a variety of historical experiences, narratives, and myths in order to place the Palestinian saga within the larger context of post-colonial tragedies.
أما أنا فإنني أبحث عن شاعر طروادة، لأن طروادة لم تروي حكايتها.
In contemplating his poetic legacy, one is reminded of such great universal and humanist poets like Pablo Neruda, Walt Whitman, and Louis Aragon, who celebrated freedom and universal justice. Darwish himself inhabited a humanist space, inviting everyone to his internal dialogue with his displaced self, as it committed itself to an eternal journey of liberation. His poem, The Penultimate Speech of the Red Indian, is a powerful protest against the erasure of indigenous cultures by the colonizers, bringing to mind what the Israeli occupiers have been doing in Palestine and trying to change its original Arab identity through a systematic policy of Judaization. So much so that peace for the poet seemed far-fetched, because the Israelis are morally dead when they refuse to recognize the legitimate rights of the Palestinians. Let us give the earth enough time to tell the whole truth about you and us. O you who are guests in this place, leave a few chairs empty for your hosts to read out the conditions for peace in a treaty with the dead. He even accompanied a group of renowned international writers on a tour through the devastated streets and alleys of broken towns turned into sites of horror by the Israeli soldiers. In 1998, Darwish was on the verge of death for 2 minutes during a heart surgery. He was revived, and the experience of living a temporal death inspired him to write the epic poem Morale, published in 2000, which is about confronting mortality and emptiness and the triumph of art over death. However, with every collection of poems, Darwish brought something new and inspiring to his readers and the critics. In his later poems, he moved, as one critic put it, from the lyrical style of his early resistance period to a fusion of lyricism and longer epic poems employing biblical and Canaanite mythology and symbols. His poetry turned more autobiographical and explored the personal memory of time and place. His volume, Why Did You Leave the Horse Alone, 1995, was a poetic defense of narrative and memory against the erasure of the victim's rights. Darwish's ultimate loyalty, aside from his national adherence to his homeland, was to poetry. He was quite frank about not wanting his poetry to become a hostage of politics, because he strongly believes that every beautiful poem is an act of resistance. Darwish's work won numerous awards and has been published in 20 different languages. A central theme in his poetry is the vision of homeland. His early writings in the classical Arabic style. He wrote poems adhering to the metrics of traditional Arabic poetry. In the 1970s, he began to move away from these neoclassical rules and paradigms and adopted what might be called a free verse technique that did not follow strictly classical meters. For nearly half a century, it was not uncommon for Darwish readings to draw thousands of people. Many thousands more bought his books and listened to his poems as they were set to music, most notably Ritta and the Rifle, Birds of the Galilee, and I Yearn for My Mother's Bread, that have become anthems for at least 2 generations of readers. Famous Arab composers and singers like Marcel Khalifa, Ahmad Kabour, Majid al-Rumi, Asala Nasri, and others sung his poems and helped broaden the scope of his impact on his readers and listeners alike. Marcel Khalifa in particular was unique among Arab singers who transformed Darwish's poems into popular songs, setting up a bridge between poetry and music. For at least a decade, Khalifa was working on Darwish's poems without ever meeting the poet, finding a common denominator between his folk music and Darwish's poems of resistance.
سلام عليك وأنت تعدين نار الصباح. سلام عليك وأنت تعدين نار الصباح. سلام عليك سلام عليك. أما آن لي أن أقدم بعض الهدايا إليك. أما آن لي أن أعود إليك. لديني لأشرب منك حليب البلاد حليب البلاد حليب البلاد. لديني لأشرب منك حليب البلاد، حليب البلاد، حليب البلاد، وأبقى صبيا على سعيديك، وأبقى صبيا إلى أبد الآبدين، وأبقى صبيا على سعيديك، وأبقى صبيا إلى أبد الآبدين. أما أنا لي أن أقدم بعض الهدايا.
Darwish was buried in Ramallah, never able to return to his birthplace because of the savage Israeli occupation. It is hard to think of another poet who enjoyed such immense popularity and received such high critical acclaim, one whose work incarnates the collective tragedy of millions of Palestinians and Arabs across the globe. He was many poets in one, and his Palestine, his eternal love, will always be alive, challenging death and oblivion, because he himself has immortalized it in his poems, telling death in its face that it cannot trap the immortal. Oh, death, all the arts have defeated you, all the Mesopotamian songs, the Egyptian obelisk, the pharaoh's tombs, the engraved temple stones, all defeated you, all were victorious. You cannot trap the immortal. Death may have triumphed over his weak heart, but his inspiring legacy will endure across the ages. He will remain a universal symbol of resistance against occupation and a powerful cry against injustice, inspiring future generations to be more committed to their noble cause of independence and self-determination.